So something new I'm doing for my conference talks this year is I'm trying to make them more accessible to people with disabilities. So for anyone here who's blind or visually impaired, I'm going to read all the slides, any text, describe any images that are part of the content. And this is part of the presentation, so you probably won't even notice I'm doing it. This not only helps people who are visually impaired, but someone who's dyslexic, has trouble reading, people who don't speak English as their first language. If you forgot your glasses at home, you're too far from the screen. For those of you here who also give talks at conferences, I hope you'll consider doing this too, because it's very important to make our content as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. Thanks. The title of my talk is Code is Not Neutral, the Ethics of Programming. I'm Clarissa Peterson. You can find me on Twitter. It's at Clarissa, C-L-A-R-I-S-S-A. So what is ethics? At the basis, it's the responsibility to do what's right. And different religions and cultures have different approaches to ethics. Now, back in history, there might have been different approaches to ethics. But the basis is just not harming other people. But in reality, that's not so straightforward. Some ethical standards are law. For example, it's illegal to murder someone. And yet there are exceptions, like in self-defense. Professional ethical standards are common in many professions, including technical fields like mechanical engineering, electrical engineering. And they do this because when you're making a building or a bridge or a spaceship, if you have an ethical lapse, you could do something that could basically kill a lot of people. And we don't think of software in the same way, but we should, because the things that we make really do affect a lot of people. So we have a responsibility as developers, designers, programmers, software engineers towards other humans. And if there aren't rules for us, we may have to figure it out. So auto emissions is a big problem. Here you see a clogged highway in Minnesota with haze from all the pollution. There's strict laws about emissions in many countries, so auto manufacturers want to make sure their cars can pass these laboratory tests so their car doesn't emit too many harmful pollutants. The problem is that many of the things they do to reduce emissions can have a negative effect on the car's fuel economy or performance. In 2015, the US Environmental Protection Agency found out that Volkswagen had intentionally programmed a certain type of diesel engine to activate some emission controls only during laboratory emissions testing. So while they were able to pass the US tests, when you were actually using the car in a real-world situation, there was up to 40 times as much nitrogen oxide being emitted as there was during the test. So what caused this back in 2006, a man named James Liang, who was an engineer of Volkswagen, was working at their plant in Germany, as you see here, designing a new diesel engine for cars in the US. This new type of engine had better fuel economy, which was great, but it was not as good at containing emissions. So he worked on this and realized he couldn't make this new engine pass the US standards. So instead of fixing the engine, he designed the software to cheat the emission tests. The engine not only passed all the tests, but the Volkswagen got green car subsidies and tax exemptions in the US. What you see here is their car that won the 2009 World Car of the Year. When the discrepancy was discovered, Volkswagen at first claimed it was a technical glitch, but when evidence showed up, they admitted to it, and the CEO resigned a few weeks later. Now, before you think it's just a little pollution, remember that pollution causes actual deaths. For example, this picture is of London. You can barely see the skyline because of all the haze from pollution. In London, about 6,000 people die each year from long-term exposure to air pollution just from NO2, which comes from diesel engines. Worldwide, it's around 100,000 premature deaths per year, a number that's rising. As far as the Volkswagens that were cheating on the emissions test, they did a study and found that just in the US, from these engines that were cheating, there were about 59 additional deaths. So those are actual deaths caused by the person who wrote the software to cheat the emissions test. And those Volkswagens, besides actually killing people, also contribute to cases of asthma, bronchitis, and other respiratory diseases. As is expected in this sort of thing, the company's paying billions of dollars in fines, and some of the executives are facing prison time, including one that was recently sentenced to 7 years in prison. But there's something a bit different this time. In 2017, James Liang, the Volkswagen engineer who I mentioned earlier, was sentenced to 40 months in prison as well as being handed a $200,000 fine. He's not a high-level employee in this case. He's just an engineer who wrote some software. So that could be any of us. Here you see on the screen, this is Liang as he pled guilty in a screenshot from a TV news show. Although it's pretty clear that something like that is illegal as well as unethical, there are a lot of situations that come up where it's not so clear. One example is when you realize that the software you're working on could be harmful if it's used incorrectly. When creating software, you need to think through the worst case scenarios of how it might be used and figure out how to prevent them. You all heard about the false alarm missile alert in January, right? It was a Saturday morning, and Hawaiian residents and visitors received this message on their mobile phones in all capital letters. It said, "Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill." People were running around in panic. They were driving at high speeds to get home to their family members. The fire department stopped responding to calls. I've seen pictures online of people who were putting their children into storm drains for protection. Can you imagine how it feels to hear that you and your family might die in the next few minutes? That's what 1.5 million people were feeling. When this first happened, it was thought that the false alert was because the person accidentally clicked the wrong link. There was a lot of analysis of this interface and how easy it would be to make this mistake. Turns out the person actually misunderstood that it wasn't a drill, so this wasn't actually the issue. But it's still worth looking at because this is something that could have happened. What you see on the screen is a mock-up of what their interface supposedly looks like. They won't share the actual interface for security reasons. So you see a list of several links in what seems like random order. The two that are significant here, one says PACOM CDW state only, the other one says drill PACOM CDW state only. So it's two links with almost the exact same name, and it seems it would be pretty easy to click the wrong one. There's multiple steps to confirm, including entering a password, but the steps are the same whether you're doing a test or a real alert. So if you were the one creating the software, you should be thinking about the worst case scenarios and how to prevent them. So it's easy to look at this and go, well, what can go wrong? What if somebody clicks the wrong link? So you should be adding things in there to prevent that. Make the drill case and the real case have different messages and make it very clear which is which. But also, for a worst case scenario, you need to think about what if it happens and then what? So, for example, here you would want like a link or a button to cancel the alert, something to send another text message saying that's the false alarm. But they didn't have that. So the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency, it took them 38 minutes to get authorization to send out a second message. That's 38 minutes where people were thinking that they were about to die. So here's where ethics comes in. If you worked on that software, whether you were the designer, the developer, programmer, product manager, whatever your role is, you know that this could have serious consequences. So you should take time to think about the worst case scenarios and do everything possible to keep them from happening, and then how to recover when that worst case scenario does happen. That may not be part of your job, but you should do it anyway because you're working on this software and you're responsible for making it exist. Here's a tweet from UXer Jared Spool where he says, "Anyone who influences what the design becomes is the designer. This includes developers, PMs, even corporate legal. We are all the designers." So even if you know that others on your team are responsible for thinking about worst case scenarios, responsible for making sure what you're doing is right, you should be too. The more people that are thinking about what can go wrong, the more likely you are to collectively come up with all the possible bad things and find solutions for them. There's lots of ethical issues that come up when you look at Internet of Things devices. For example, if you make a connected refrigerator, one worst case scenario is that your fridge stops working. So this is a tweet from Sean Doyle where he says, "So, my new fridge stopped working because it needed a software update. You guys, I don't think I want this future. Hashtag first world problems." Someone should have thought of that. You get home and all your food has gone bad. Here's another one. This is an Instagram post from Ryan Negri with a picture of a car stopped on a deserted road with mountains in the background. So this is one of those cars where you use your phone to start the car. Both the phone and the car must have cell service for it to work. But if you happen to stop somewhere without cell service, how do you start your car again? In this case, the driver didn't even stop the car. He just put it in park for a minute, but was unable to drive without cell service. So what happened then, someone who was with him had to climb 2 miles up a mountain to get cell service, call someone to come get them, and take the driver home to get his physical key fob and bring him back. Now, apparently, when you buy this car, they tell you you should always carry the key fob with you as backup, but not everybody's going to do that. I looked online and found tons of people saying that they don't carry the key fob. After all, if you buy a car that you don't need a key to start, what's the point if they make you carry the key, right? The driver, by the way, says he knows it was his fault, but he does think there should be some contingency solution. This doesn't only apply to remote areas. You may not have cell service in an underground parking garage. Or what if there's a major disaster like an earthquake and the cell service goes down? You want to evacuate the city, but your car won't start. If you're working on any physical product that's run by software connected to the internet, you definitely need to be thinking of these worst-case scenarios. And remember that part of these worst-case scenarios is that people don't always do what you want them to do. They don't carry their backup key, they'll forget their password, they'll fail to do software updates. Plan for all of these things. Ethics means not creating problems that leave people stranded on a mountain. Another thing to consider in ethics is how algorithms work. They can be biased because the people who make them are biased, but you may not even realize that algorithms that you're using are biased. A few years ago, researchers at Carnegie Mellon University did a test. They created a series of fake Google profiles for male and female job seekers, and then these profiles visited job sites on Google. Some of the profiles encountered an ad for a coaching service for $200,000 plus executive jobs. This ad was shown 1,800 times to male profiles, but only 300 times to female profiles. So this is like a high income opportunity, but it's being shown a lot more to the males. So this happened because companies are likely targeting this type of ad in particular ways so that men are more likely to see it. So how do we stop this? When we're making algorithms, we also have to think of the worst case scenarios. Another one, in 2016, news organization Publica published this article titled "Facebook Lets Advertisers Exclude Users by Race." So you can target ads on Facebook to not be shown to various ethnic or racial groups. And this was applied to housing ads. In the US, targeting housing ads by race is a violation of the Fair Housing Act, which has been law since 1968. And this is a really big deal. So in February 2017, Facebook announced they were implementing something that would automatically check for this type of thing and not approve this sort of ad that's discriminatory. But in November 2017, Publica decided to test it again. What you see here is a screenshot from their test ad, which reads, "Exclude people who match at least one of the following behaviors: multicultural affinity, African American, Asian American, Hispanic, Spanish dominant." So based on the announcement Facebook had made, this ad should have been refused, but it wasn't. They were able to post their ad. There was recently a conversation on Twitter on this topic, and I'm actually showing you several tweets in this presentation because it's really important that we're talking publicly about this sort of thing. The tweet you see, designer Dan Hahn tweeted, "What if you're asked to write ad segmentation and targeting code that would allow for, say, excluding black people from housing ads, and knew those ads wouldn't be reviewed because the infrastructure didn't exist?" So he thinks that the designers and the programmers shouldn't have created this functionality. But then Bramble tweeted in response, "The thing is, nobody wrote software for real estate ads to be targeted by race. They wrote a bunch of systems which combined let you do good targeting and also lots of kinds of ads. The problem comes at these weird intersections." So what he's saying is Facebook never intended for this to happen or be allowable, but they didn't realize that it could be a problem until somebody pointed it out. So this is an example, again, of a worst case scenario. If you're having something like targeting in your product, you need to think about the ways that people can target and what could go wrong. Especially if you have gender or racial categories, there's the potential for a lot of things going wrong or people using it in really bad ways. You need to actually try thinking like a bad person sometimes. In design, we use a tool called personas, which is basically a profile of a specific imaginary user. You can also create personas for your worst case users, literally. Here's a tweet from Gretchen Anderson where she says, "This is why you need evil personas. How might casual racist dude use this? How might someone who's privileged is threatened use this?" So you might not think of every scenario, but you can at least think of some and help to make it better and less likely that things that are bad will happen. If you're working on a powerful tool, you have the responsibility to keep it from being used for bad. And you can't predict everything, but in this case, Facebook now knows about the problem and they aren't fixing it. Another thing to actively think about is, are you leaving out anyone in the things that you're creating? Often we call these edge cases. We usually don't worry about them. We design for the majority of our users. You can't please everyone after all. And this is fine, except when you're leaving out people who are already marginalized, like users with disabilities. And this is a whole field called accessibility, to make your software or website available to everyone. But if you work on websites or software, you need to make sure it can be used by these people. You don't want to marginalize people with disabilities. It's not about the percentage of users that they make up, or if you think they will or will not want to use your software. It's just part of being a reasonable human being to make sure that you're not leaving them out. So whatever you make, think about accessibility. This means your software needs to be accessible to screen readers, so it can be used by people who are blind or low vision. Otherwise, they can't use your software. Your video content needs captions, so it can be used by people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Otherwise, they can't watch your videos. You need to not have blinking things that can cause seizures. Otherwise, you risk causing actual harm to people. You need to make sure the language in your interface is simple and clear, so it's accessible to people with learning disabilities, people who have a different first language, or people who are not privileged enough to get a good education. Your site or your software needs to load fast for people who don't have fast broadband connections. This affects a lot of users living in remote areas like First Nations reserves, or people who can't afford fast connections, and they won't be able to access your site if it's too slow. Making software accessible is just part of being an ethical developer. If you're excluding edge cases, you also need to make sure that it's not because of race or gender or ethnicity. It's easier to include everyone if you have a diverse team. If everyone on your team looks and thinks alike, it's harder to understand your diverse users. Facebook is a good example. When you sign up for a Facebook account, they ask for your name, but they don't really understand what the range of possible real names is. For example, they've suspended Native American users who have names like Lance Brown Eyes. They say that that's not a real name, but it is. They don't allow you to put in a name like De La Cruz that has too many words. There's people who are Asian or of Asian descent who have had their names rejected on Facebook because their name in their own language has the same letters as a bad word in English, but it's their actual name. For many people, this has happened despite providing documents to Facebook proving that that is their actual legal name. If their team had more diversity, they would have had a better understanding of how there are different types of names in the world. Here's another example. Google, a couple years ago, added a feature to their photo app that would automatically identify objects. So it did okay with skyscrapers and cars, but black people were labeled as gorillas. That's pretty horrible, you guys. And this is a tweet from someone named Jackie, and he said, "Gorilla photos, y'all effed up. My friend is not a gorilla." And there's several labeled pictures below that with the one of two black people labeled as gorillas. This wasn't intentional by Google, but it happened, and it's really bad, and they should have found this in testing. By the way, only 1% of Google's technical staff is black. 1%. Some things have even more serious consequences. In the US, police use facial recognition software in various situations. For example, if they encounter somebody when they're undercover, they can later find and arrest them. Facial recognition software is not always accurate. It sometimes identifies the wrong person, and it doesn't always hold up in court. But here's the thing, not only is it not always accurate, but it's more likely to misidentify a black person than a white person. So why is that? They did some research at the MIT Media Lab, and they found that algorithms are usually written by white engineers. They're based on existing code libraries, which are also written by white engineers, and based on previous research in the field that was based on white faces. So facial recognition software learns by looking at more photos, but these are usually photos of white people, so those are the faces that it learns from. Facial recognition software is not tested to look for this kind of bias, so whoever is using it out in the real world likely doesn't even know that this bias exists. You don't have to have a diverse team to make software have less racial bias, but it's likely to help. So you should look around and see who's on your team. And even if you can't change your team, at least think of who your software will affect and do what you can to remove any bias. In general, a team of people will be better at solving any type of problem if the team is more diverse. They've done studies on this. This means diversity by race, by gender, by economic background. Silicon Valley hires a lot of people from Harvard and Yale. It's basically a bunch of rich white guys. And there's nothing at all wrong with rich white guys, you just don't want everybody on your team to be a rich white guy. Find some other people and have all sorts of people on your team. So that brings us to the workplace. In what ways do we need to think of ethics in our workplace? Hiring isn't directly a part of software development, but some of you will be a boss at some point in your career. How can you create a more diverse team? If your team hasn't been diverse in hiring in the past, look at who you've been interviewing. If you only interview a bunch of white guys for a position, then there's a 100% chance you'll hire a white guy. The NFL, the National Football League in the United States, has something called the Rooney Rule. In past decades, the league hasn't had many people of color in head coaching positions and other senior roles. So Dan Rooney, who was the head of the league's diversity committee at the time, came up with this rule that was implemented in 2003. That's Rooney you see on the screen, along with some NFL Hall of Fame players. He's a tiny little old white guy in the middle, and he looks like he's about half the size of everybody else. So what the Rooney Rule is every time there's an opening for one of these top positions, at least one minority candidate has to be interviewed. It's not affirmative action because they're not required to hire somebody who's a minority. All this does is make sure that the team is fairly considering minority applicants. In the first 3 years after the rule was in place, the number of black head coaches increased from 6% to 22%. As a note, almost 70% of the players are black, so why shouldn't their bosses be black too? Some other sports and even some tech companies have put similar rules in place, Pinterest, Amazon, and Facebook, to name a few. Your company can do something similar too. Just make sure every time you have an open position, you're interviewing at least one person of color and at least one woman. If they aren't the best candidate, you don't have to hire them, but it's likely that you'll find some great candidates that you might have overlooked otherwise. The next problem, though, is what if women and people of color are not even applying to your jobs? You can't just blame them for not applying. You need to figure out why they're not applying and fix it. Maybe you're not posting on the right job boards. Maybe you're relying on word of mouth and all the applicants are networked with your current, not very diverse employees. So look online for ways to better reach out to more diverse applicants. And think of what to write in the job description. A lot of them use gendered language, such as describing their ideal candidate on only using he and him. I saw one job post lately that started, "Dear guys." More recently, I saw Cory Froy post this on Twitter. He said, "Friends, do you know of a great female engineering IT leader looking for a CTO role? Remote company doing some real cool work." People jumped all over him, claiming it was reverse discrimination, that he was violating the law by asking for people to recommend female candidates. It wasn't illegal because he's not saying he'll only hire female candidates, he's just asking for people to recommend them. Cory responded to one criticism saying, "We give subtle and overt clues to women and minority candidates all the time that they aren't welcome. If you want to broaden the pool of people, sometimes you have to let them know you understand that history." Which is true. Because if he had posted, "Do you know of a great guy looking for a CTO role?" nobody would have complained because we're used to it. It does help to let people know you're going to make sure they're included. And this means making sure your workplace is welcoming to women, people of color, people who are transgender, people with disabilities, and people from other countries. One of the areas of technology where ethics really comes into play is artificial intelligence. AI can describe a lot of different things, but most generally it's when a computer or a machine is able to perceive and learn from its environment and make decisions based on what is learned. This includes things like computers that can play chess, self-driving cars, software that automatically takes photos like we talked about earlier. That sort of thing is called machine learning. None of these uses of AI are perfect. A computer that can play chess is pretty good. It's not hard to get a computer to think when the options are precisely defined, such as in chess. But self-driving cars are hard because you can't define every possible decision that it could face. And many are ambiguous, such as determining whether a pedestrian looks like they're about to step off the curb. One example of when ethics and morality comes into play is a self-driving car may face a decision where it's inevitable that there's going to be a crash. Perhaps the brakes have failed and there's a choice between hitting and killing a pedestrian or hitting a stationary object and killing the person inside the car. Humans sometimes face this choice, but in a split-second decision, you don't necessarily have the time to make a truly rational decision, and you certainly don't have the same information the car has, such as mathematical formulas calculating the exact path and velocity and force of the collision. But the autonomous car can and will analyze all that data in a split second and make that decision. The car will decide who to kill. It will. And if it's deciding between the inevitable death of one or the other person, should it favor the passenger or the pedestrian? Or should it pick one at random? Should it favor the younger person who has more years left to live? Or should it use facial recognition to figure out the identities of the two people and save the person with a higher net worth? Hopefully not that last one, but in theory that is possible. It's this sort of thing that can make humans uncomfortable with the idea of autonomous vehicles. Even though they'll definitely save many lives overall, perhaps up to 90% of traffic deaths, it may not be your life that it saves. I'm almost done, Mark. Sometimes it's the government doing something unethical, and you need to decide what side you're on. Immigration is a huge issue in the US. Here you see the border wall at El Paso, Texas. In the US, the government's using software and databases to both decide what foreigners are allowed to come in the country and to identify and track people already in the US to see if they should be deported. The immigration agency, ICE, has been looking for companies to make new software that would track many sources of data about immigrants. Use sources such as social media to find out who is, and I quote, a positively contributing member of society. The problem that people see with this, there's going to be so much data that they'll find a reason to deport anybody they want. For example, if you're an immigrant and you post a picture on Facebook of you drinking a beer, does that make you not a positively contributing member of society? Many tech companies have pledged not to help build software that will track people based on a religion or to aid in mass deportations. And this is getting a lot of discussion on Twitter. Ada Rose Cannon tweeted this, responding to ICE wanting to track visa holders' social media activity. She said, as a developer, if you are ever asked to do something like this, pause and look at yourself and see what you are enabling. Someone else would do it, so I might as well get paid for it is not an excuse. Don't build evil. Don't enable evil systems. We need a tech Hippocratic oath. And people are resisting. In February, Jordan Deardahl Roberts quit his government job in the US because he had asked to do a task that would help deport undocumented immigrants. He wrote on Twitter, I work at the Montana Department of Labor. There were going to be ICE subpoenas for information that would end up being used to hunt down and deport undocumented workers. It would have been my responsibility to prepare the information and hand them off to ICE. I refuse to aid in the breaking up of families. I refuse to just follow orders. Here's another person that didn't just follow orders. This is a picture of René Carmi, often called the first hacker. He was the Comptroller General of the French Army in the 1930s and then headed the French census, where data was recorded on IBM punch cards. The Nazis wanted to use the census to find out who was Jewish. So this man, he kept doing his job, but he also found ways to hinder the Nazis. So he physically hacked the punch card machines so that nothing could be entered in the column for religion. This data was missing for thousands of people. He and his team were eventually caught and killed, that was probably the fate they expected for doing this. But let me tell you what the result was. Next door, over in the Netherlands, 73% of Jews were found and executed. But in France, where Carmi hacked the punch cards, it was only 25%, because they couldn't find them. They didn't know who was Jewish. Many, many thousands of lives were saved because he hacked the data. I really hope none of you are ever in a similar position in your lifetime, but there will be other things asked of you that may feel ethically wrong, so don't just follow orders. When you're thinking of how ethics affects programmers, developers, really the bottom line is that everything you make is going to be used by a human or affect humans in some way. So you have an obligation to understand the effects of what you build and think about especially all the worst case scenarios. Computers don't have their own morality, so it's up to you to figure out how to make them do the right thing. Thank you.